Climbing Mount Everest is one of the most incredibly difficult feats there is. And while there are some who have lived to tell the tale, what they witnessed on the trails will likely haunt them for years to come. Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Kennedy, and today we are going to be counting down some of the most terrifying things that have been seen or found on the daunting trail. So get ready, because these are the top 10 scary things found frozen on Mount Everest. First up, in our number 10 spot, we have mummified remains. There is a huge debate surrounding if George Mallory was actually the first man to ever reach the summit of Mount Everest or not. In 1924, George Mallory, along with his climbing companion Sandy Irvine, was spotted through a telescope a mere 200 to 300 meters shy of the summit, but sadly, they never returned, leading to almost a century of speculation as to whether they actually were the first to reach the top of the mountain or not. Years later, in 1999, the remains of George Mallory were found, mummified and lying head down on the north side of the mountain, and it was widely believed from the injury marks that Mallory died from a sharp blow to the head, caused by crashing into a rock jutting out on the mountain. So definitely an unsettling thing to come across. However, the group that discovered him hoped Mallory's camera would be with his remains, and that once and for all they would be able to settle the debate if they had reached the summit or not all those years ago. But the camera was nowhere to be found. Moving on to number 9, Rainbow Valley. Don't let the cheery name fool you. Rainbow Valley is anything but. The area found along the Northeast Ridge route, unfortunately, is not a fun stop along the hike, but it is actually a pit of dozens of dead bodies from hikers who did not survive the journey. The area earned its name due to the amount of bright jackets and gear either left behind by climbers or still wrapped around their frozen bodies. And many hikers who have passed it and survived the journey say it is a very freaky and eerie section to walk through. There are apparently corpses strewn across the mountain in this area, despite the fact that Nepal law states that bodies should be removed immediately to keep the sacred sanctity of the mountain. However, it happens so often that it is virtually impossible to do so. According to Strange Remains, other climbers will occasionally attempt to push them to a better resting place, but as they are frozen solid, sometimes that is not even possible. Moving on to number 8, a UFO. So this next one isn't technically a frozen thing that was found, but it's a pretty crazy story about something that was seen on the mountain still, so I had to include it today. Back in 1933, while on his first attempt at Everest's summit, English climber Frank Smythe was alone on Everest's North Ridge when he witnessed something that would leave him speechless. He says he saw, quote, 2 curious objects floating in the sky. They strongly resembled kite balloons in shape, but one possessed what appeared to be squat, underdeveloped wings, and the other a protuberance suggestive of a beak. They hovered motionless but seemed slowly to pulsate, a pulsation incidentally much slower than my own heartbeats. What's more is that prior to this alleged UFO sighting, Smythe claimed to have been visited by some unidentifiable force during his ascent and felt a strong presence beside him as he moved up the slopes. Apparently, he even took a slice of mint cake from his pocket to share with this invisible companion, having believed the immaterial entity to be entirely real. Moving on to number 7, a frozen astronaut. While on leave from NASA, Carl Gordon Hennies decided to take a hiking expedition to Mount Everest with a British research group called High Adventure BVI, with the intention to test the tissue equivalent proportional counter at different altitudes. This study was going to reveal how people's bodies would be affected, including the way bodily tissues behaved when struck by radiation, which was important for the planning of long-duration space missions. However, unfortunately, unfortunately the mission didn't go to plan. Prior to the start of the hike, Hannelore acclimatized in Nepal, followed by acclimatization at Expedition Base Camp in China, and following those, Hannelore with 3 members of High Adventure BVI began the hike on October 4th, 1993. However, Hannelore soon reported breathing problems on his way to Advanced Base Camp, and when the oxygen treatments failed, they decided to return to base camp. Tragically, that night, Hannelore died in his sleep from high altitude pulmonary edema, and his body was left on the mountain per his own request prior to heading out on the mission. Coming in at number 6, green boots. One of Everest's most notorious landmarks seen on the north route is called Green Boots, and it is rather darkly named after the green mountain boots worn by the corpse, who not only marks the spot, but also whose identity is still up for debate. It's unknown when the term green boots became the unofficial official name for the corpse and the area, but it was first recorded in May of 1996 by British filmmaker and climber Matt Dickinson, and eventually, over the years, it became a common term as more and more of the expeditions from the north side encountered the body of the climber curled up in the limestone cave. Now, as I mentioned, it's not confirmed who this climber was, but many suspect the corpse belonged to Indian climber named Zewang Paljar, who was part of an Indian summit attempt in 1996. Paljar and his team members were caught in a blizzard, and sadly, all but one succumbed to the elements just after descending from a successful summit attempt. The infamous green boots and the man remain to this day and serve as an eerie landmark for hikers passing by. Moving on to number 5. Maurice Wilson. In 1933, Maurice Wilson hatched a plan to fly into the northern slopes of Everest, crash land his plane, and then solo climb to the summit. He trained in Britain, hiking and learning to fly planes, before spending the winter in Darjeeling, where he prepared for his climb by fasting and praying, which he believed would be enough to see him to the peak. His plans, however, to fly a plane close to the summit and then hike from there were turned down by the authorities, and so he had to go to plan B. Instead, he decided to start his quest from the Rambuk Glacier. So Wilson set off on foot, but with a lack of climbing experience, a lack of how to use equipment, and putting too much faith into prayer to get him all the way, he soon found himself in over his head. Then on May 22nd, 1934, he was eventually blocked by an ice wall, and the following year in 1935, his body was found in snow surrounded by his blown apart tent. Next up at number 4, David Sharp. After 2 unsuccessful attempts with groups in 2003 and 2004 that resulted in him losing several of his toes to frostbite, David decided his goal to reach the summit of Everest was not yet over. In 2006, he made his 3rd and final journey, and for some reason was determined to make the trek without supplemental oxygen and minimal equipment. Now, it's been debated whether David actually made it to the summit or not after all, but at some point he began a descent, but sadly, he never made it all the way down. David crouched down in the shelter of the Green Boots cave we spoke about earlier, and ultimately succumbed to the horrifically frigid elements overnight. Now, what's especially scary about David Sharp's case in particular is that allegedly at least 40 other climbers were recorded passing by him prior to his actual death, and the other climbers were accused of ignoring the unspoken climber's code of helping out their fellow travelers when they are in distress. Now, according to them, David was already too far gone by the time they passed him, but either way, passing a man actively dying or passing an actual dead body are both scary options if you ask me. Moving on to number 3, a familiar face. As has become abundantly clear during this video, there are sadly quite a few dead people along the route to the summit of Mount Everest, but I would imagine this man's experience would be one of the more jarring ones. In 2011, Rodney Hogg was attempting to reach the summit on Everest when he actually bumped into a corpse who seemed eerily familiar. As it turns out, it was. The perfectly preserved body belonged to his late friend Peter Kinloch, who sadly, after conquering the summit, suffered snow blindness during descent and died on the way back down. Although his guides and Sherpas tried desperately to help him down the mountain over a span of 10 hours, they were soon deprived of oxygen and began to suffer hypothermia themselves and were eventually forced to leave him behind. When his friend Rodney found his perfectly preserved icy corpse a few months later, he spent a few moments paying his last respects and then continued on with his attempt. Coming in at number 2, Sleeping Beauty. Now, if you ask me, I think the nickname is a bit morbid, but that really is what this woman was called for many years. In 1998, American climber Frances Arsentiev was joined by her husband Sergei and successfully became the first woman to reach the summit without the use of supplemental oxygen. But sadly, she did not get a happy ending following that. Just 1,000 feet away from the summit, her nearly frozen body was discovered by 2 other climbers, Ian Woodall and his fiancée Kathy O'Dowd. Following the unspoken climber's code, the couple gave up on their own journey to assist her and help her survive any way they could, but sadly they soon realized it was already too late. Apparently her husband Sergei had left after attempting to supply his wife with oxygen and medicine from fellow climbers, but died trying to find her again. And the climbers said Frances's last words to them, "Don't leave me." For years her body remained frozen in plain view, but in 2007 Ian returned to Everest and brought her body to a lower position to rest in peace with a proper burial. And last up in our number 1 spot today, Hannelore Schmatz. In 1979, Hannelore Schmatz became the 4th woman in the world to reach the summit of Mount Everest, but unfortunately her glorious climb to the mountain's peak would be her last. Originally she had started the journey with her husband, but after some troubling weather conditions, the Sherpas separated the hikers into 2 groups and the couple got separated. Hannelore's group left for the summit early in the morning and reached the top, but sadly the journey back down was riddled with danger. According to the surviving group members, Hannelore and another climber, Ray Jennett, became too exhausted to continue and wanted to set up a camp to rest. However, they were in the middle of what's called the death zone, and so the Sherpas warned against it, urging them to continue back to the base camp for safety. Ray Jennett went against the Sherpas' warning and stayed anyways, and tragically passed away from hypothermia. Hannelore, however, listened to the advice and continued to trek through the treacherous conditions with the 2 Sherpas. But sadly, just 330 feet from camp, her body gave out and she sat down to rest against her backpack. Her last words were, "Water, water." That day, Hannelore became the first woman to die on Mount Everest, and her frozen corpse still remains on the mountain to this day. Well, that's all I got for you today, friends. Would any of you ever climb Mount Everest? I'm not sure I'm up for it. Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to hit that subscribe button before you go. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you next time.